Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So we are into a new kind of section. We started the last time, and that has to do with the fact that not only is Abraham's name changed, in other words, from Abram to Abraham, but Sarah's name is changed from Sarai to Sarah. And there's some subtle differences in the sentence structure between Abraham's name change and Sarah's name change. And so, of course, taking the magnifying glass and looking at these things more intensely, we're going to examine that. So here we go. So, Ki Sarah Shma, for her name is Sarah. Notice how I said it. Her name is Sarah. It doesn't say, and he's going to tell you this. It's not because it doesn't say her name will be Sarah. It says her name is Sarah. And in fact, the way you can translate the Hebrew is, for her name was Sarah. Sarai he Sarah. That is to say, Sarai and Sarah are identical. That is to say, Batchila naset Sarai le'umata, before she was Sarai to her people, ulevasof, but in the end, ne'eset Sarah lachol ha'olam, but then she became the Sarah, the princess. That's how we would translate it to the entire world. So let's take a look. Nir'eh, it would appear, the mefaresh Sarai kamo Sarai. So he's saying that he's explaining this word Sarai as being a possessive form, like Sarai means my adversaries, but oivai, and my enemies. That's in the book of Psalms, Psalm 27. Uvichinui leumata, right? And it's a nickname, right? Or possibly a metaphor or an attribute, this word kinui, right, regarding her. Uma dechativ tichtiv ki Sarah shma, and the fact that it uses this expression, that her name is Sarah, belashon, in this expression, shemuvan bo ha'avar, because in this we understand the past. In other words, by saying her name is Sarah, or in fact her name was Sarah, avar, for those of you who have a basis of Hebrew grammar, you know that avar has to do with a past tense, right? The perfect tense, something completed action. Velo b'lashon atit, and it does not have the connotation or the denotation of future, which would be Vahaya Shma Sarah. If it had said Vahaya Shma and her name, Shma, her name, Vahaya in this particular form is it will be Sarah. Her name will be Sarah. It doesn't say that. Kamo dichtiv ba'Avraham. And the point is that that's the way it's stated with regards to Abraham. And I want to go back a little bit so we can see where this takes place. Now, we're going to have to go back quite a bit here to find it, okay? All right, so let's see what we can do here. I'm sorry, just trying to get the right size here. Let's see where it is. Okay, this is all the laws about the circumcision here. Uh, Still back a little more. Yep, still back a little more. Here we go. We're almost there, right? So here it is. Here it says, but first of all, it says, "V'hayita la'avam goyim," right? You shall be the father of a multitude of nations. But here, "V'lo yikarei od et shimcha Avraham." Your name shall no longer be called Avraham. And this is the expression that he said, that Torah T'mimah was referring to. It says, "V'haya shimcha Avraham." Your name henceforth will be Abraham. And the point that he's making is that is not the way it's expressed in the Torah here. So this raises some interesting issues, okay? And we're going to try and get into them a little bit. Let me make sure I can find the place. get back to where we were. Almost there. We've covered a lot. Here we are. They're right here. Okay. So now we know. Right. Let's make sure. Let's see. Yes, here we are. Right. So this is it says, right? It says Hayash Ashma Vakamo Dichtiv. Okay, so let's make sure I have exactly all right. Right. So that's the way it was for Abraham. Yesh lomar. So what's the difference? What's going on here? One can say, Mishum. In other words, why is her name? This is a question that Torah T'mimah is asking. Why the difference? Why doesn't it simply say, her name was Sarai, but henceforth it'll be Sarah? But the way in which it's expressed in the Torah is that her name was always Sarah, right? It's just that in terms of the meaning of it, right? In the past, she was my princess, but in the future, she's going to be the princess of all the nations, right? So, Yesh Lomar, in terms of trying to answer this question, one might say, Mishum, because the be'emet miyad keshenit baser Avraham, that the moment, because truthfully, the moment that Abraham was told Beshinui Hashem regarding his name being changed, She'inyano hu midchila, that is to say, right? We understand that midchila haya av Aram, because before, and it says there that he was the father of Aram, Ulevasof av lechol haolam, and in the end, he was going to be the father of the entire world. Okay, and he says, this is, you can look at above to verse 5. Ulefima de kaimalan, and according to a principle, a halachic principle that we have, the isha im ba'ala ola imo, that a wife, a woman with her husband, goes up in status together with him. In other words, to put this a different way, that if a husband's status is improved, the wife's status is automatically improved. She goes up with her husband. And this is in Ketuvot Samach Aleph, that's page 61a of Ketuvot, Tractate Ketuvot. Hainu, that is to say, Shenochelet gam hi kvodo ugduato. That is to say, that she inherits to his honor and his greatness. Im Kain, right? So it reminds me of a wonderful statement. A woman I knew in when I was in St. Paul, Minnesota, who had a crackerjack wit, and I remember her giving a speech one day, and she said, "Behind every successful man is a proud wife and a surprised mother-in-law." At any rate, just what can I say? So, getting back into this, Imkain, if this is the case, miyad shenishtane shmo ligdula, the moment that Abraham's name was changed to for greatness, liyot sar lachol ha'olam, to become the prince of the entire world, zachta gam hi, she also merited liyot sara lachol ha'olam, to be the princess of all the world. That moment. Vezehu, and this was ki Sarah Shma. That is the meaning of saying that what the Torah means here that says her name is Sarah. In other words, when your name was changed, Abraham, she also became Sarah, a princess, Klomar, Mikvar. That is to say, already from before. Od me'az shenishtane shimcha. In other words, from the moment that your name was changed, her name became Sarah. So, okay. Again, if you feel like commenting, please do. Just you can raise your hand, let me know. Otherwise, we will plow on. Okay. Vikarata v'gomer, right? So let's go back and take a look at the text itself here. Okay, let's see. Okay, this is where it says Sarashma. Uverachti ota, and I will bless her. V'gam natati mimena lecha ben, and also I will give you from her a son. Uverachtia, and I will bless her, v'haita legoyim, and she shall become, in other words, her offspring shall be for nations, malchei amim, kings of peoples, mimena yu, from her will come. Right? So there will be kings coming from her. Vayipul Avraham al panav. So make sure I didn't go too far, right? So we're going to verse 19, right? Vayipul Avraham al panav, vayitzchak. And Abraham fell on his face, and he laughed. Vayomer belibo, and he thought to himself. In other words, he said, literally it says, he said within his heart, Halavin me'ashana yivaled. Is it possible for a child to be born to 100-year-old person? Ve'im Sarah, and whether Sarah habat tishim shana taled, is it possible that Sarah at 90 years should also give birth? Vayomer Avraham ela Elohim, and Abraham said to God, Lu Yishmael yicheh lifnecha, if only Yishmael were to live before you. Vayomer Elohim, and God said to him, Aval Sarah ishtacha yoledet lecha ben. He says, nevertheless, Sarah, your wife, will give birth to for you a son. V'karata et shmo, and you shall call him Yitzchak. Right? He will laugh. V'hakimoti et briti ito, and I shall establish my covenant with him, levrit olam, as an eternal covenant, lazaro acharav, for his seed following him. So we're not going to necessarily get into it here, but I still think that the statement that Abraham makes to God about Yishmael and the compassion he shows for Yishmael is something very beautiful and touching. And actually, I wish it were, in fact, something for both the children of Abraham and the descendants of Isaac and the descendants of Ishmael could understand this, that they have a common grandfather or grandparent or ancestor that would love for them to be able to live together. So that's one way to understand this. So Yishmael, of course, is going to live, but when he says Yichyeh lefanecha, that's the key phrase, right? Is the sense of connectedness to God should live before you. And to understand that phrase, to imply the relationship that the Jewish people were supposed to have with God in fulfilling the Torah and the mitzvot, that being able to fulfill commandments is actually such a significant act of living before God. You could say it's the same thing. And that idea of having a sense that our lives are directed by the creator of the universe. So, truthfully, of course, we know that there are many commonalities between Islam and Judaism. Right, that Islam does have a concept of religious law. It doesn't go to quite the degree that the Torah law goes for Jews, at least in principle. So if you look at actually the practices of, for example, kashrut or Shabbat within Islam, you'll see that while they are extremely significant for practicing Muslims, they are not to the very degree to which, or strictness, the level of strictness that they are for Judaism. I do not speak as an expert. I only speak from having listened, and we had a program one time where we had an imam come and talk to us and describe for us what Shabbat was for Muslims and how they practice Shabbat. So we'll have to leave it at that. Going into here. Vikarata, you're right, you shall call her name. Tanya, so we know that Tanya is a technical term referring to a source that is pre-Talmudic, in other words, prior to the year 200, right? And that is somewhere of the Mishnaic period. Yitzchak hu achad, so Isaac was one, right? Me'ela, of those, shenikra lahem shem ad shelo noldu. He was one who was called, given his name, even before he was born. So there are few people who, and we'll look into that more in more detail. Dichtiv, as it says, Sarai ishtacha, Sarai, your wife, yoledet lecha ben, will be giving you a sign, giving birth to a son for you, v'karata et shmo Yitzchak, and you shall name him Isaac. So obviously she hasn't given birth yet, and yet Abraham is told that his name is to be Isaac. And this is from the Talmud Yerushalmi, Brachot, Tractate Brachot, Chapter 1, Halacha 6. That's the reference. So let's take a look at it. Umatzinu, right? And we find ma'alazo, this particular mila quality, if you want to call it that, right? This particular quality, but usually it means a privilege or something like that. It has that connotation, right? Rak ba'arba'a, only regarding 4 people. So we have Yitzchak. Yitzchak has that. Yishmael, because if you look previously, you'll see that the angel tells Hagar that her child is to be named Ishmael. Yoshiyahu, Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, Ushlomo, and Solomon. Ve'ien ma shekatuv la'el, and check out what is said above, right? Tet Zion Yud Aleph, so that's chapter 16, verse 11, Gabei Yishmael, with regards to Yishmael. And he goes into quite a little bit of detail as to the fact that, generally speaking, the reason why it's considered to be an element of greatness, and he questions Yishmael, is because there's a general principle that someone who's given a name before they're born is a tzaddik. And when you read about Yishmael in the Torah, you wonder to yourself, in what sense is he a tzaddik? And if you go back to that previous lesson, which we did together, you'll see that on some levels, there are 2 different reasons why Yishmael can be considered a tzaddik and be given a name prior to his birth. Now, I know that many of you are familiar with the fact that Isaac, in some ways, is called Isaac because Sarah laughs. And this happens, by the way, in the next chapter, where Abraham is visited by the 3 angels, etc., and she overhears what's happening, and Sarah's in the tent, and she laughs. But we see here that Abraham also laughed. But the laughter is for a different reason, right? Because God does not correct Abraham here for laughing, whereas he does correct Sarah for laughing. And the reason that, if you look carefully here, you'll see that Abraham is laughing out of joy, whereas Sarah is laughing out of disbelief. And that's why, in that case, here, it's so interesting, because if you think about it, laughter is a very interesting emotion, because you can laugh for a lot of different reasons. You can laugh out of anger, you can laugh out of fear, you can laugh in some ways from a sense of sorrow, and of course, laughing out of joy, and certainly laughing out of disbelief. So laughter doesn't just mean joy. And the Torah is making it clear here, at least a little later on, that you can laugh for different reasons. So you can laugh to scoff, right? So let's take a look here. Okay. I think we finished, right, okay. We'll do one more. V'karata v'gomer, okay. So you shall call him, okay. Tanya, make sure we got the right place here, right? Again, Tanya, mipnei ma, let's see, okay. מפני מה נשתנה שמו של אברהם ושל יעקב ולא של יצחק? It's a good question. For what reason is Abraham's name changed and Jacob's name changed, right? We know that his name was changed from Jacob to Yisrael. ולא של יצחק, But here's one of the patriarchs, and his name isn't changed. Mipnei, so what's the reason? It's a rabbinic question. We have an answer. Mipnei she'elu avotehem kar'u lahem shem. And the reason is that their fathers were involved in naming them. Aval Yitzchak, but with regard to Isaac, HaKadosh Baruch Hu kara lo shem. The Holy One, blessed be He, called him by his name. In other words, Abraham was called Avram by Terach, Jacob was called Yaakov by Isaac, but remember, here God is the one who calls Isaac, Isaac. Kidichtiv, as it says, Vayomer Elohim, as it says, Sarai ishtacha yoledet lecha ben, Sarai, your wife, will give you a man, child, a boy, the karata et shmo Yitzchak, and you shall name him Isaac. And this again is in this Yerushalmi little section here that clearly is dealing with this subject, and that's in Tractate Brachot of the Talmud Yerushalmi, chapter 1, halacha vav. Okay. Yen b'midrashim, right? So he says, this is, you can investigate this further in midrashim, upiresh Rashi, and Rashi explained Resh Parshat Toldot at the beginning of Parsha Toldot that's coming up in a few parshiot. But pasuk, and it's the one Toldot that deals with Isaac's life and Jacob, taking the birthright and taking the blessing. It's all in that parsha of Toldot. The pasuk where it says Vayikare et shmo Yaakov, or Vayikra et shmo Yaakov, forgive me, he called his name Jacob. Right, so at the birth of Jacob, remember he's holding onto his brother's heel. The twins are being born. He's holding onto his brother's heel, and it says he called his name Jacob. His name was called Jacob. So it could be Vayikare, or Vayikra. The Ladat Achat, right? Because according to one opinion, Kar'o HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, called him this Cain. So there's some midrash that says that, which of course would then appear to contradict this, I believe. Umidrasha shelefanenu, but in the midrash that is in before us that we're looking at now, mevuar, it says to Yerushalmi that when it comes to the Yerushalmi, lo svira lechein, they're not of this opinion. So we're saying that there is a difference of opinion here in the Yerushalmi, which claims that that Jacob and Abraham were named by their parents, and Isaac was named by God. But there's another drush in Midrashim, etc., that claim that the reason why Jacob was named Jacob was that was a name God gave him. So that contradicts what we're saying here, and according to that opinion, Jacob's name should not have been changed, right? That was the reason we said Isaac's name was not changed. So we're saying it's clear there's simply two different opinions in these traditions. Ella, right? The Yitzchak kara lo shem zeh. So according to the Yerushalmi, right, the one that we're reading, Isaac called him this name. Isaac called him Jacob. Kamo shekatuv elu avotam karui lahem shem, right? And it says here, right, explicitly in the Yerushalmi, it says these, in other words, regard to Abraham and Jacob, avotam karu lahem shem. Their fathers gave them their names. Well, the fella, and it's amazing, he says, shelo heiru hamefarshim bazeh, that other commentators did not point out this basic machloket, this basic disagreement between the Yerushalmi and other sources that are of rabbinic and ancient nature. Yes, David.
So, also a question here, maybe it's going to get answered, but it seems odd that, well, it's logical that, Abraham's name would be changed, right, because of his change in status or change in perspective or whatever.
Yes.
But Jacob, why wasn't, for Jacob, though, it seems, inconsistent. Isaac is named by God. It would seem that, from a patriarch perspective, Jacob should also be named by God so that it all continues, right? So we have why is there this, it happened, it seems inconsistent. So I don't know and that doesn't quite make sense. So that's what I'm asking is why wouldn't, it seems Jacob should also be named by God if we're going to continue that logic throughout our
Mhm.
lineage, etc. So anyway, that's my question.
Okay. I mean, from my perspective, I mean, the Yerushalmi is asking a question. There are some things that are sui generis about Isaac's life. Okay. So, for example, Abraham, we know, went down to Egypt. We also know that Jacob goes down to Egypt. Isaac does not. He's the one patriarch who does not go down to Egypt. There's a question as to why. That'll be answered later on. I'm not going to answer it now. So there's some sense in saying, Isaac was a special case, right? Um, on the other hand, it's sort of interesting because if in fact, let's say that the uh, the uh, the uh, the other, not the Yerushalmi, but the other sources are correct and are saying that essentially Jacob was named by God, that God gave Jacob that name. Then the question comes back as to then why um, does Jacob's name get changed? If the
Yep.
reason is that God named them, then we are back at that question saying, why did God change Jacob's name? And at this point, we don't have an answer. In other words, according to the Yerushalmi, we've got an answer. But according to the opinions that say Jacob was received that name from God, that is still a good question, and we could still ask it. Now, there are other ways to answer it, possibly. I mean, I could try to come up with an answer. One is the fact that the Akedah, that is, Abraham's taking Isaac and being willing to place him on the altar, already raised his status, so that Isaac is the only patriarch who gets treated like that. And that particular moment is huge. It is a watershed because essentially, because it symbolizes the fact that animal sacrifices are there and are in place to represent ourselves, that there is a sensitivity of who we are and understanding who we are as human beings. It's something that occurred to me perhaps strongly quite recently when I was thinking about all these prayers that we're saying and asking myself, what's my relationship to the universe and, this vast, vast universe, both in terms of time and space and the place I occupy relative to that time and space. And not only that, but since I do believe in a divine creator, that the world didn't just happen, it wasn't just a spontaneous creation. What is my relationship when here I am offering up prayers to the creator of the universe? And what a privilege it is, and the value of my own personal life and my own personal existence in relationship to the existence of something so vast and ineffable and fabulous. And the privilege that I have in that I have a tradition that goes down over the millennia that gives me the words to try and take my feelings of appreciation, of humility, etc., and to say these are words that are appropriate as opposed to anything I could come up with myself. Because who am I, quite honestly, to be addressing such a existent one? And I think I understand the term God fearing better because in the face of such an existence, that is what you're going to feel. And in some ways, the fact that we don't feel this way has a lot to do with our ignorance and also our own narcissism, possibly, etc.
It's arrogance. I mean, literally, I
It is.
think it
That's
really
true.
is.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Yes, you picked the right word. And by the way, that is represented by the chametz that we
yeah,
get rid of in Pesach. That
yep.
getting into the leaven is symbolic of trying to get rid of that arrogance. So, your question, of course, led us into some other kinds of issues that I hope, you know, you feel are worth thinking about.
Oh
And
yeah, thank you.
you bet. So take care until we meet again. On Sunday, I will check what we're doing for our next lesson. But at any rate, have a Shabbat Shalom. I'm just going to stop the recording.